Hello, I'm Dr. Jodie Richardson, and you're listening to Well, Hello Anxiety, a podcast where we end the struggle with anxiety and build our toolkit of practical skills to thrive. Who will I be without my eating disorder? Today's guest posed that very question to herself and then sought the help of a therapist to support her on her journey to find answers. Dr. Helena Popovic is a doctor with a special interest in the brain, Alzheimer's, obesity, and type 2 diabetes. She's currently practicing as a general practitioner in Coffs Harbour, but soon to be permanently on the beautiful Gold Coast in Queensland. In addition to being a GP, Dr. Popovic is the author of NeuroSlimming. She's a professional speaker, and that's where we met when we were both on a conference tour together. She also works one-on-one with coaching clients and runs retreats and has a new book coming out, which we're going to talk to her about as well. So, Dr. Helena Popovic, thank you so much for joining us today.
My absolute pleasure.
Thank you. Where are you coming to us from? Where are you?
I am on the sunny Gold Coast. I live there, which is known as Jalurgal, and it's on the lands of the Yagambeh-speaking peoples, part of the Bundjalung Nation, and I respectfully acknowledge the traditional owners of the land and pay my respect to their elders past and present.
Oh, how beautiful. Thank you so much. So the Gold Coast, for our overseas listeners, is a beautiful destination in sunny Queensland, which is a northern state here in Australia, and it's a place that I have visited many, many times. And it's also the place in Australia where we have the most amazing theme parks. So if you haven't visited, come on over. So Helena, thank you again for joining us. And that question that you posed to yourself, the one that I opened the podcast with, it's such a powerful question. And it obviously is one that provokes so many other questions from me. But I'd like to just start by asking you to share a little bit about, or a lot, please, about your journey with your eating disorder. Tell us about that, please.
It's the hardest thing I've ever had to grapple with in my life, and answering that question was certainly the biggest challenge I've ever faced. I had a 20-year struggle with an eating disorder from the age of 13 to 33, mainly binge eating, but, I dabbled with everything from anorexia to bulimia, fasting, feasting, starving, the whole bit. So, but essentially I was a binge eater. And like everyone I've ever met with disordered eating, it was a survival mechanism, which is really what anxiety is. And by survival, I mean protecting us from physical, psychological, emotional harm, being able to get through a trauma or stressful situation. And so really what we have to start unpacking and understanding is how to reprogram that survival mechanism. And I did, I practiced all the different things that you've talked about on your podcast, deep breathing, box breathing. I exercised. I made sure I slept well. But until I got to the real core of the issue, as in what was I using my eating disorder for? What role was it playing in my life? And what would happen if I let it go? Until I asked that question, I was never going to get over it. And so the first thing I had to do was to distance myself from it and not talk about it as my eating disorder, my anxiety, but I'm struggling with food at the moment. I am not managing anxiety well at the moment. So that's the first thing, rather than using the possessive pronoun my. So
Yes.
That was the first thing. And then secondly, I realised that I was using binge eating in order to be a nice person. And I was terrified that if I no longer had an eating disorder, if I no longer had my food friends, my Tim Tams, Maltesers, ice cream, whatever I could get my hands on to binge on at the time that I needed it, if I gave those friends up, and I do use the word friends deliberately because they were the only friends I could confide in, if you know what I mean, in terms of allow them to see how I was really feeling. I was terrified that I might say something to someone I'd regret later, that I might actually tell somebody I was upset with them. And I had a reputation for being really nice. Oh, Dr. Popovic's lovely. She'll do it. She'll do the overtime. Or nothing ruffles her. No, nothing ruffled me at the time because in my mind I was already planning the binge that would help me get over the current anxiety or stressful situation. And the turning point was when I realized this was like, well, how am I going to let go of this? I want to be a nice person. And I went to see a therapist, and she taught me that it's very classic, very common, but you don't learn it in medical school. It was to say, when you say this or when you do this, this is if a person is causing your anxiety, although, nobody can cause your anxiety. Nobody can insult you or put you down without your permission. I knew all that, but nonetheless, I rehearsed over and over. When you do X, it makes me feel Y. And there was a particular situation that was ongoing and really causing me to binge a lot. And that was, because I was a junior doctor, and I was assisting a surgeon who I felt was just treated everybody abominably. Zero respect for anybody, yelled, demanded, please and thank you were just not part of his vocabulary. And I practiced this for weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks. And I finally mustered up the courage when he spoke to me in a very derogatory way, as he did to everybody. I said, when you speak to me in that way, it really diminishes me and it actually makes me perform worse. Would you mind not speaking to me like that? Because then you'll get the best from me.
Yes, I love that.
And I just thought the whole world I just was terrified of what he would say, what everyone else would say. Would I be thrown out of theatre? Would I lose my job? Nothing happened.
What happened?
He said nothing. The day went on.
Yeah.
But after he left, everybody high-fived me.
I love that.
It was like, I did it. It was, to me, it was such a huge thing to have been able to speak my truth for the first time in that situation. And I really didn't care what his response was going to be. The important thing was that I was able to execute. And it was the first time that I went home and didn't binge.
Goodness, how powerful it was then to set your boundaries. So powerful. And so when you would binge, would it be because it was a way to just cope with all of the stressful situations that could have been dealt with more empowerment and confidence as you did on that particular day, that you were able to manage the stresses of the day by being authentic, experiencing how you feel and setting your boundaries, so that by the end of the day, there wasn't a need for you to somehow kind of release all that stress through
Yes, that's correct.
Food.
I was using food as drugs.
Yes.
Because I was getting that massive, I can remember that feeding frenzy, you get this massive adrenaline rush. So you're energized and empowered. And then that, I don't know what order all the all the neurotransmitters were happening, but you got adrenaline, you got noradrenaline, you got dopamine, it was like this massive, and at the end of it, feeling physically disgusting in my stomach, but it was like, So it was that physical sigh of relief in a sense. And it was also, it's a bit like when you're going on holidays next week, you can burn the candle at both ends because you just push through till you get on holidays. It was the same thing. I could just push through the discomfort of the day, whatever form it took, because I knew at the end of the day, I would smile in anticipation of being able to eat those dreadful things. So that's what it was. So it was knowing that I had that solace at the end of the day and the physical release that came. And so, if you took that away from me, who would I be? I could be a really awful person.
Who would I be? How would I cope? What would I say? And so that first night when you went home after that absolutely momentous day, and I love that your colleagues high-fived you, and I think it's good for us to remember that when we're not being treated well, we're typically not the only ones. But in the following days, how did things begin to change? Was that a little bit like the idea that we just need to get started and we can begin to develop momentum with change? And did that empower you to then become more confident to set other boundaries and to protect yourself and look after yourself? Because we really teach other people how to treat us, don't we?
We do. That was just the beginning. I mean, it wasn't just a one-off and then everything was solved. I had to keep repeating that. The next time I saw the surgeon, that was, what was going to happen next. He started to speak to me in a derogatory, and then he caught himself and said, "Oh, doctor here won't perform at her peak if I speak to her in this way, so I'd better not." I didn't need to say anything. And even though it was sarcastic and not nice,
yes,
that was okay. I was fine. I was fine with that, because it was like, oh my gosh, she's actually paid attention here. That was probably the most obvious situation, but there were so many other situations that I would have to rehearse. So that, that was one situation, and then I'd identify another situation, and I'd have to rehearse saying that. It was weeks. I rehearsed that. When you say this, I feel that. I rehearsed that for weeks. And then I found, other situations, including within my family. Mum loved me to death. And that was literally loved me to death almost, because she would just, food was the language of love in my family. So there was also this, when I was there, I was expected to eat more. That was her language of love. So I also had to learn to say to her, "Mum, I love your cooking. I love your food. But when you insist I keep eating more and more, I actually don't feel well afterwards." So, I had to sort of negotiate with so many different relationships in my life, because then you don't even realize are infringing on your boundaries because you're so used to it.
yes.
And it's only when you start dealing with the bigger stuff that the smaller stuff you realize is also not quite, because I thought, well, now that I've gotten over this, okay, I'm fine now. It's like, oh no, but there are other situations that bring this on as well. It's an ongoing thing. But as I said, that was coupled with releasing having an eating disorder as my identity. And that was coupled with, you talk about learning to sit with your anxiety. I learned to sit with my cravings. So still occasions when they still occurred. And I would then, and this was the hardest thing I've ever done, equally hard to the speaking my truth, was to just sit there with the feeling of the craving. And it's like, it's worse than the worst itch that you can't scratch. Sometimes my body was even just shaking because it was just so uncomfortable. But I knew, like, I so trusted the therapist. She said, it will pass. And I loved the book by John Ruskan. I don't even remember the title of the book, but it was about feeling your feelings. And it was just having read enough that gave me the confidence that this too shall pass.
Yes.
And that it wasn't going to take an hour. I wasn't going to have to sit there in discomfort for an hour. It literally was minutes, because I timed it, because it felt like easily 10 minutes, but it was probably 2. And it just passed. And that was one of the most empowering feelings, because it was like, if I can sit with my worst feelings, I can sit with anything. I can cope with anything.
It's the fear, isn't it, of if I allow myself to feel this, what's going to happen? What's going to come of me? And obviously one of your questions was, who will I be? Who will I be? I remember speaking to my psychologist and him saying to me, when I'd been through major depressive disorder and had cried and felt the lowest that you can feel, the lowest a person can feel. And I remember when he said to me once, "You've been the saddest a person can be, and you've gotten through it. And if and when that happens again, which inevitably it will, we lose loved ones and friends and pets, and things happen that make us feel distressed and sad and all sorts of feelings." And it was really empowering for him to say, "You know what, you've done this. You've actually, it doesn't get worse than that.
Yes.
And you've done that. And this is what you're talking about. This is what you're saying."
And this is now such a tool for anything that I encounter in life. I use when I'm stressed in the moment. It might be a new audience that I'm facing, and I've been told they're a cold audience or something.
That's the worst thing, isn't it? That someone can say to a speaker, "Oh, they're a really hard audience." You're like, "Oh, thanks a lot."
Yeah. But any difficult situation, I use 2 methods apart from the box breathing, and the momentary mindfulness and meditation. I call it my strength story, and my miracle moment. My strength story is when I'm about to walk into a challenging situation to remind myself of the time when I succeeded and didn't think I would. Now, sometimes it's just going back and going, hey, I got over an eating disorder. I can get over anything. But sometimes it's just remembering. I did a holiday on Fraser Island, and I love bushwalking and I want to explore as much as possible. But I was there by myself. There was no way known that I was going to camp in the middle of Fraser Island with dingoes.
Mm-hmm.
No way, by myself. So I decided that I would stay at the 2 resorts on either end. Now, I didn't want to do the 4-wheel, the sand driving by myself. So I would have to walk from one resort to the other, which was over 30 kilometres in sand in one day. Because I didn't know if I was going to make it. I mean, I'm pretty fit, but hey, 30 kilometres in sand with a backpack with all my stuff was a challenge. And so the short answer to the story is I made it. I walked from one resort to the other, and it was just exhilarating. And I even managed to get a swim, and take photos along the way. So that's another one of my strength stories. Whenever I think, oh, am I going to make this? You know what? I made it across Fraser Island. I can do this. Now, it's just remembering that success story changes your physiology.
Tell us how.
Because when we have an image of something strengthening, empowering, we actually start to produce noradrenaline, which is the power of focus, acetylcholine, dopamine. All of these are energizing neurotransmitters. And just thinking about those experiences changes our brain chemistry and makes us more capable. There was a wonderful study. I feel sorry for the students, but it was done on school students. They all had the same level of mathematical ability, and they were all given a maths test. But group 1 was given a really difficult test they were designed to fail. Group 2 was given a challenging test, but designed that they would do well in, and they all performed as expected. The kids were then given a break, and then they were told their results. And then they were all given a second test. Now, the second test was the same for both groups. It was easier than the first group had been given, but harder than the second group had been given. And the question that the researchers were posing was, does performance in the first test influence performance in the second test? Now, we would normally think if you're going to achieve something, you better go from easy to hard. Or no, hard, or knock off the bad thing first.
Oh, okay, I see what you're saying. Sorry. Yes, yeah.
Oh, whatever. But what they found was that the kids who had done the hard test first and then went to the easier test, you'd have thought, oh, they're going to nail the second one because they've did the hard one first. No, the opposite happened. They did significantly worse in the second test than the kids who had done the easy test first, because of their self-talk going into the test. The kids who had failed the first time walked into the second test saying to themselves, I performed really badly in the first one. I'm not good at this. I hate these tests. So they were already talking themselves out of doing well. The second group of kids walked into the second test saying to themselves, I nailed it the first time. Don't see why I shouldn't nail it the second time. When we perceive ourselves as more capable, we actually become more capable. It's called cognitive bias modification. We start to notice more of what we're doing right than wrong. We start to notice more of the things we're good at rather than not so good at.
Whereas the negativity bias and anxiety can tell stories of deficiency and I can't, and this urge to avoid and retreat and withdraw because it's uncomfortable or it's difficult. And so, yes, I love that research is it's incredible the way the studies are designed and the outcomes that can be learned. And I love that you've been able to really share with us how the way we think can significantly impact the way we perform and what we're capable of.
Yes, and I have a maintenance strategy. This is so powerful for me, and it was very, very weird when I first started doing it. And this is one of the missions in Mission Slim Possible, which is all part of NeuroSlimming. Give yourself a clap, not a slap. And what I mean by that is every day, throughout the day, Give yourself a mental pat on the back every time you accomplish something. Now, you don't have to shout it out to everyone. Just have a quiet word to yourself. I'm really pleased with myself at how I handled that situation because it could have been really tricky. I did really well to make that deadline. I'm proud of myself for getting to the gym today when I really didn't think I'd have time and I felt I was too tired. Because we're really good at beating ourselves up for our sins and really bad at acknowledging our wins. And so when we start doing it, it just feels uncomfortable. I mean, telling myself, I did a good job. We just don't tend to do it. But it makes such a big difference because of this cognitive bias modification that we start to notice more of what we're doing right because we're starting to acknowledge it more. And that's my main, I make sure every day, even if it's just, I cooked that piece of fish to perfection today. I'm really proud of myself for that. I've got all this stuff around the house that helps me. I call it all my maintenance strategies. This keeps my stress down, my anxiety down. And look, for 20 plus years, I have not ever had another food craving. That's how much I don't use any willpower not to eat junk. I just don't feel like it anymore because it's no longer part of my identity. So I'm just putting that to the side. But I've got a gratitude box and a laughter box in my house. And whenever something happens that me or my partner feel really grateful for, we write on a piece of paper, put it in the box. And then on World Gratitude Day every year, which is the 21st of September, which happens to be World Alzheimer's Day. It's a day of celebration in our household. We have a special dinner and we read all the notes we've read throughout the year. And it is the best night of the year because you've forgotten all the things that you've been grateful for throughout the year. Let me tell you a really beautiful story about that. It changes people's lives. My girlfriend was in a really bad work situation. She just really didn't like her job. And I just kept saying, you've got to find, another job. You've just got, I know I need the money. It's just too hard. Single mum, just couldn't change at the moment. And she actually heard me, I didn't even think of suggesting this to her, but she heard me give a presentation where I talked about the gratitude box. She said, you know what, I'm going to put a gratitude box at work. At least it might I might start noticing a few good things about work. And so she had this beautiful box on her desk and people would walk past and say, oh, has somebody given you a gift? And she'd say, no, this is my gratitude box. I've just decided that I write things down that I'm grateful for throughout the day. And so she decided on World Gratitude Day, she'd take it home. And when she opened the box, she said, I couldn't believe how many bits of paper were in there. And she said, and I said to her, yeah, I know, you forget what you've written. She said, no. What had happened was when she was away from her desk, people had written thank you notes to her and put it in her box without her knowing. And it brings tears to my eyes whenever I tell this story because she had the work culture was you never said anything. There was not a culture where people praised each other or thanked each other. And it was like, oh my gosh, I never thought anybody appreciated anything I did. And it was like suddenly it actually changed her whole attitude to work. She brought a different energy to the workplace and the whole thing just spiraled up.
She felt so appreciated. And I know that in a workplace and in life in general, a little bit of appreciation. I mean, she had a lot of appreciation and I just love that. I honestly got goosebumps when you were telling that story. But that it's so powerful. In fact, it can be more powerful than increasing someone's salary, can't it? This idea that you get told you're doing a good job, your work and your efforts are appreciated. It's so powerful, so powerful.
As is the power of laughter, which brings me to the second box, our laughter box. And when something funny happens, we write it down and we put in the box. But the power of the laughter box is not recording the funny experiences, is looking for them. Because is you kind of you now have a filter that I want to put something in my laughter box. What am I going to put in my laughter box today? And seek and ye shall find. What you focus on expands in your life. So if you're looking for things to laugh about, I tell you what, there's something to laugh about every day. There really is. It's just, you just make it happen.
Helena, I know that one of the most powerful things that you did was you changed the way you thought about progress, didn't you? Away from perfection. I know I've heard you speak about that before, and I wondered if you could share with our listeners how you changed the way you thought about change.
One of the most powerful things I ever did was to change my overriding life goal. Actually, to set an overriding life goal, because I didn't have an overriding life goal. And when I made growth rather than a specific outcome my goal, that actually changed everything. And I define growth as growing towards being of greater service to others in my personal and professional life, period. Because when growth is the goal, then mistakes are allowed. You know, remember Einstein said, anyone who has never made a mistake has never tried anything new. And I can't grow if I don't try new things regularly. And new things have the potential to bring on anxiety only if I fear that something bad might happen as the result of trying that new thing. But if the goal is growth, then even an undesirable outcome is feedback and not failure. And that just reframed everything. And it's almost a joke in this family. You know, I'll put something in the oven and then I'll get distracted and the fire alarm goes off and my partner will go, oh, I think that's the fire alarm giving you feedback. You know, not failure. You know, so, but it really does change it when you realize, and I honestly believe that is the ultimate goal of life.
Yeah.
Just to grow. Everything is here to grow. And you just
Yes.
cannot grow without trial and error, without a mistake. And it's not our mistakes that define us. It's how we deal with them. That no matter what happens, choosing to be a victor, not a victim.
Yes.
And simply the definition of a victor is choosing to grow from the experience.
Growing from the experience, which is it's a huge mindset shift, isn't it? And I think it's forgiving. It's forgiving. It just takes the pressure off, doesn't it? It just
so much so.
Yes.
And so just taking that pressure off too reminds me, can I just tell you about a study? It was 30,000 adults. So it was a big study and they wanted to examine the effects of chronic stress. And they found that, you know, there's no denying that, you know, severe long-term stress erodes our physical and mental health, for sure. 80% of visits to the doctor can be attributed to stress. However, people who experienced high levels of stress but did not view stress as detrimental, instead, they viewed stress as an opportunity to grow, as character building. They had better health, less depression, greater life satisfaction, greater resilience than those who viewed their stress as detrimental and harmful and stressed about their stress.
Yes. Yes.
So how we label something is extraordinarily powerful.
You remind me of an interview I did with Jessica Maguire where we talked about the vagus nerve and the vagal brake and how we are fully equipped to cope with stress, and that the vagal brake gets released. We have the mobilization of everything we need to be able to cope, and then the stress cycle ends up being completed in however it needs to come to an end. The vagal brake returns on our heart and the stress cycle is complete and we move on, and we are completely and fully equipped to cope with stress in that way. But for some people, obviously, the stress is chronic. And like you say, the perception, once again, the way you think about it. And I think before listening to this episode, before listening to our conversation, some of our listeners may, and I've had the joy of hearing you speak and hearing you talk about perception and how it affects our biology when we were on the Positive Schools conference together. So I've had the joy of learning from you previously. But the idea that the way we think can actually change our physiology is a game changer, isn't it?
Yes. I'll tell you another study, how it affects our immune system in a very real way. This was a study done at the University of California Drama Department. So the brain researcher went in and said, okay, we want you to practice method acting today. And method acting is where you put yourself in the mind of your character. So you think of a time when you felt like your character felt. And they did, one group had depressing scripts all day, and the other group had really uplifting, upbeat, happy scripts all day. And throughout the day, they took blood samples and they measured their white cell count and the subtypes of white cells, which are the cells in our body that fight infection. When we talk about immune cells, we're talking about T cells and B cells and the various subsets of white blood cells. they were astounded that the group that were working with depressing scripts, their white cell count started to drop throughout the day. And when they tested them with bacteria, the white cells were sluggish in responding to infection. And those that been working with uplifting scripts all day, their immune system was robust and was performing perfectly well. That's after just one day of acting.
Yes.
Remembering bad times.
Yes.
It hammers our immune system.
Yes.
It is really powerful. So, be careful what you think, because it really does affect us. But I want to make the point that, as you say, anxiety serves a very, very important role in our life because it does protect us. There was a brilliant book I read many years ago, The Gift of Fear. And it was by Gavin de Becker, I remember, probably in the late 1990s, I think he wrote it. He was an expert on violent behaviour. And basically he interviewed people who had been mugged, assaulted, sexually abused. And every single one of them, when they really, really thought about it, said, you know what? I did have a bad feeling about walking down that street, but I ignored it. I really felt uncomfortable when that person asked me for directions, the one that eventually assaulted them, but I didn't want to look like I was mean and unkind, so I did stop and gave them directions, and then what happened. And he said, we know instinctively, if we really pause long enough to listen to our gut, and that's the anxiety, whether something is, now it can go off the scales and respond inappropriately as well. But all I'm saying is, I'm just affirming that anxiety plays a really critical role in our lives, and it can save our lives.
Yes, it can. It can. And actually, you've brought me to a question I wanted to ask you, because I know you have 3 pillars when it comes to anxiety management. I'd really love for you to share those with us.
All right. Well, you and others have defined anxiety as our response to a perceived threat. Okay. Response to perceived threat. There are our 3 pillars: the response, the perception,
yes,
and the threat.
Mm-hmm.
Now, imagine a stool with 3 legs. If you remove one of those legs, what's going to happen?
Going to fall on your bum.
Stool topples over. In
Yes.
the same way, if you just dismantle one of the 3 pillars of anxiety, the anxiety dissipates. So my 3 pillars are, whenever I feel anxiety, I ask myself the 3 questions. 1, can I remove the threat? Because that's one, because there might be something real out there, i.e. is the threat, the dark alley? Well, get out of that dark alley. Is the threat, that you're seeing this person approach you that feels uncomfortable? Just get out of the way. So sometimes we can remove ourselves from the threat, sometimes not. But that's the first question. If it's not the external thing that's causing the anxiety, then the second question is, can I settle or soothe my response? Because remember, the second pillar is response. And that is that racing heart, sweaty palms, dizziness. So that is whether it's the box breathing, whether it's I do a sprint interval training if I can. Sometimes, if I'm about to walk into a nervous situation and I don't have to look my best, I will just run as fast as I can for 30 seconds, like really fast. And that gives, a massive release of adrenaline and dopamine. And I just feel it just washes away that momentary anxiety. Yes. So that's dealing with our responses. And that's also making sure that we get, the good night's sleep. And then the third thing to dismantle is our perception. Because it's a perceived threat. It's not necessarily an actual threat. Remembering we don't see things as they are. We see things as we are. I can be confronted with a difficult situation at work one day and think, yes, this is going to be a challenge and I'm up for it. Another day, because someone nearly ran into me on the way to work, and then I received a call from my GP saying I needed to come in and see her about my blood test results. Well, that same work situation will be overwhelming and I won't know where to start. So asking myself, okay, this situation that is now apparently threatening, what else might it mean? Can I view it in another way? So you're not trying to talk yourself out of it. It's important to be asking the question, not saying, now come on, this really shouldn't be causing me anxiety. No. What's another way I could interpret this? What's another way I could view this? instead of calling this a problem, why don't we call it a challenge, a growth experience, whatever it happens to be. So it's just, and you know what, just asking those 3 questions, even if you don't have an answer, suddenly you're disengaging your amygdala and engaging your frontal cortex, and that will settle your amygdala because you're not giving it the energy. Can I remove the threat? Can I settle my response? Can I change my perception? They are rational questions. So immediately you're not engaging as much of your emotional brain. So just asking the questions in themselves, even if you haven't got an answer, is going to settle that anxiety to a degree.
I've never had that explained in that way, and I really love that particular approach because it makes so much sense and it gives people different angles to come at it from, because it's like you say, you take one of them away, then it just falls away. And that's what everyone who's listening to this podcast is looking to understand. What can I do to change my experience of it? So I know one last thing, if I can keep you with us just a little bit longer, one last thing that I really want you to share with us, because you have so much expertise, and we could, and we probably will, if you're willing, do a whole episode talking about this. But I know how passionate you are about good, wholesome, healthy, nutritious food and the difference that makes for our mental health. And I wonder if you could share a little bit about the way you were eating and how that was affecting your mental health when you were binge eating, and what you could share with our listeners as a bit of a takeaway for them to think about the way they eat a little bit differently.
I think we so underestimate the power of food to affect mood. Yes, we talk about it. Yeah, food affects mood, but I don't think people really realize it. And I don't think it's only now starting to come up in the health conversations that ultra processed food is not food. Junk food is an oxymoron because junk food is simply junk. So let me define ultra processed food, because a lot of people say to me, no, I'm really good with my diet. I don't eat any rubbish. I don't eat processed food. And then when we unpack it, I eat way more processed food than I realized. There's different levels of processing, but basically then the worst level is ultra processed food. And it is really a carefully contrived concoction of cheap industrial chemicals, fillers, flavorings, colorings, stabilizers, emulsifiers, thickeners, bulking agents, anti-foaming agents, anti-caking agents, anything identified as an additive or by a number. Now, all of those things individually, let alone when you've got them all in one, individually erode our health. And I will talk about how in a moment, but I just want people to be able to identify first. Anything with any of that in it is toxic to a greater or lesser degree. And the other reason that ultra-processed foods are toxic is because they remove the fiber, they remove the water, they remove the real proteins, because proteins are more expensive than carbs, and they add sugar, refined starches, and hydrogenated fats. And here's the problem. They don't cause immediate harm that we notice right in that moment, although they can. It's largely delayed harm. For me, it was binging on that food just actually perpetuated the anxiety, because studies have found that the more processed food a person eats, and it isn't even just the obvious junk food, the biscuits and the lollies and the donuts and the ice cream and all of that, but it was even just packaged food, frozen meals, because they still have a lot of emulsifiers, hydrogenated fats, refined starches, everything added to them. Every little bit of processed food that you add to your diet increases the likelihood of a mental health issue, depression, anxiety. There was a particular one, it was in the journal Nature, I think it was early 2020. They published a review of 61 studies on the relationship between adult mental health, firstly, and fruit and vegetable intake. And they looked at depression, anxiety, attempted suicide, sleep quality, optimism, the whole thing. And the first thing they found was that a higher intake of whole fruit and vegetables, especially leafy greens, berries, and citrus, absolutely protected against depression, anxiety, and so on, and promoted high levels of optimism and self-efficacy. So the first thing is adding more of the good stuff into our diet made a difference. And then there was a study at the University of Tasmania. Actually, I think that one came first. This was on teenagers, and the more processed food they ate, not just junk food, but even your breakfast cereals, things that sound healthy, the greater their incidence of depression and anxiety and markers of chronic inflammation and insulin resistance. Now, I was binging on this stuff, and basically having all those processed chemicals in me actually put me on this major dopamine roller coaster. I was like high 1 second, literally, and then crashing the next. And it just perpetuated a low grade level of anxiety eating this food. And I think the problem is we just don't realize just how much they do affect us and just how toxic they are, because the food industry has brainwashed the whole world into consuming toxins as treats. Let me just give you one stat that's horrifying. Every 1% increase in our consumption of ultra-processed food increases our risk of cancer by 1.2% and our risk of type 2 diabetes by 1.5%. Every 1% extra of ultra-processed food. And the mechanisms are all those chemicals and the high sugar, anything that contains a seed oil, which is what we call vegetable oils, which is your sunflower oil, safflower oil, soybean oil, cottonseed oil, rice bran oil, canola oil. They are not only highly inflammatory, but when you heat them, they produce chemicals called aldehydes, which are actually carcinogenic. Now, you might say to me, no, I'm safe. I don't cook with any of those oils. I only cook with coconut oil, olive oil, butter. I believe you. But the second you eat out, doesn't matter where it is, you'll be consuming those oils because they're so much cheaper. You cannot eat Indian, Thai, Chinese, Vietnam, any of those Asian foods. Do they taste good? Hell yes. But they are loaded with vegetable oils. They don't even have olive oil or butter or coconut oil in their kitchens most of the time, unless it's a really upmarket. Greek, Italian, 5-star restaurants, they do have olive oil and butter in their kitchens, but the smaller ones that have to survive just can't afford to use them. It's not that chefs are trying to poison you by any means. It's that they don't know any better. I mean, I'll ring up a restaurant and say, what oils do you use in cooking? And they'll proudly tell me, we only use vegetable oils. We only use rice bran oil. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. I won't be making a booking. And I was going to say testify. I'm not in court, but I remember when we went out for dinner, you and I went out for dinner in Perth, and you made sure that we could go and dine out somewhere where we could eat a really delicious meal that wasn't cooked in a vegetable oil. And
yes,
it was such an eye-opener for me, actually, because I only have olive oil, coconut oil and butter in my kitchen.
Of course. By the way, avocado oil and macadamia nut oil are also extremely healthy oils.
Yes.
And they withstand high heat. Beautiful flavours as well. Just a little aside.
Yeah,
on that note, though, I just want to make sure that I don't tip people into orthorexia. That's not anorexia. That's not wanting to be abnormally thin. Orthorexia is the obsession with being healthy. So I don't want now to put people into a state of, I can't eat out anymore. I can't eat anything because everything's going to be tainted. Look, the poison is in the dose. So the problem, though, is the phrase everything in moderation. No, that's not true, because smoking in moderation, no, that won't work. Vaping in moderation won't work either. But, having the odd bit of vegetable oil once a month is not going to kill you. But I even think once a week is too much. But please don't obsess about this. Your body is terrific at self-healing, and it won't fall apart just because you've had a mouthful of food that is not on your healthy list. So I just had to make that point. And the other point I want to make is the only way we're going to get around this is to stop labeling toxins as treats. If you want to eat biscuits, make them yourself.
Yes.
because then you're going to be using butter and you're not going to be using emulsifiers and nasty vegetable oils. Okay, so if you want to eat it, cook it, then it's
Yes.
okay because you're
Yes.
using real ingredients. But anyway, the point is we need to stop labeling toxins as treats. Is it a treat going to the dentist having a filling? I don't think so. So yeah, the best way to get around it is, number one, to start to view these things for what they are, poisons. Number two is to fill our life with other treats, with non-food treats, because that's something we learned as a child. Our parents, in all their love, would treat us with an ice cream, would treat us with sweets, because that's kind of what we did. But we need to treat ourselves in different ways: a bubble bath, a massage, a walk, in nature, just reading a trashy novel, whatever it is you love to do.
Patting a dog.
Patting a dog, yes. Looking at a sunset, looking at the night sky. If your listeners have not listened to the podcast on awe, that was just so beautiful. And filling our life with real awe absolutely removes that need for a sweet treat or whatever your treat has. Because really, that's what it is. If you're feeling depressed and miserable, do you ever soothe yourself with a plate of Brussels sprouts? No. When we're using food to soothe us, we're not eating spinach. We're eating rubbish. So it's a matter of finding other things to soothe us.
Yes, yes. And the experience of life can be enriched with no cost, and each and every day there are beautiful, nourishing things that we can do for our mental health, for our body, for our mind, that are available. You just have to look around you, and I've got three, one needs a drink actually, but one, two, three, four actually, plants in here. And just taking a moment just to look at the beautiful colours on the leaves, the veins where the water and nutrients are moved through the plant. Just sometimes taking a little moment in nature can be the uplift that we need. And like you were talking about food, the same can be said for alcohol or for other
Yes.
drugs as well.
Yes.
We know that, and as a doctor, you would see it all. You would see it all.
Can I just interrupt you there, because this is a really important point? People who have had bariatric surgery, as in, they have their stomach operated on in one way or another so that it reduces the size of the stomach so that they can't eat as much anymore. If you don't address, because remember, I have yet to meet someone with an eating disorder for whom it is not a survival mechanism. So if you haven't dealt with what is driving that disordered eating, I can't tell you how many people turn to alcohol. If you haven't got a psychologist on board, or you haven't dealt with what's been driving that disordered eating.
That's right, that behaviour. And Sarah Rusbatch, who I've interviewed twice, when she speaks about alcohol, she's a sobriety coach, that when people give up alcohol, they often turn to sugar. And so
yes,
it's about
flip side of the coin.
Yes, that's it. It's about numbing. It's about avoidance. And look, life is hard. I mean, we know that we're not meant to be happy all the time. A rich and meaningful life has all sorts of ups and downs. You just have to own a pet or be a parent or have a meaningful person in your life to know that the beautiful joys of connection and relationships and love and friendship and pet ownership come with really difficult lows. And yet, would we trade one for the other? I never would. Most people would say, no, I'd rather have the highs and deal with the lows. But I think this idea of acceptance, which I talked about with Carly Taylor, and I know that you're familiar with Carly's work and her husband Paul's work, this idea that it's okay to feel low. And like you said, with the binge eating disorder, the most overwhelming cravings to soothe yourself through this food, and that you would only probably stop when you felt sick to your stomach.
Yes.
That if you can sit through those cravings and recognize that I'm experiencing this urge, I know what's happening and I know it will pass. And you said you timed it. It was a couple of minutes. Doing that repetitively helps to retrain our brain and rewire our brain.
Yes, it does.
And help us to learn that, we can cope with the difficult times. We don't do ourselves any favors psychologically, physiologically, in any way, emotionally, when we look for ways to escape it. But, we're saying it's possible. It's not easy. And like you said, that the help of a therapist, somebody to support you is, a really important piece of the puzzle, isn't it?
Yes. And you've said it before, but when we numb negative emotions, we also, to a degree, numb the positive ones as well.
Yes.
The opposite of love isn't hate. The opposite of love is apathy. When we lose someone and we grieve, the depth of that grief reflects the depth of that love.
Yes.
As you said, you can't have one without the other.
You can't.
It's just part of the human condition.
It is. It is. I saw a lady at the airport a couple of days ago who just reminded me of my nan. And all my grandparents have passed away, and I just dearly loved my nan. My mum's mum and I were very, very close. And I remember when she passed away and just the sadness. But I saw this lady and it reminded me of my nan, or if I passed by somebody who wears the same perfume nan wore, I have these memories. I feel sad that she's no longer with us, but
yes,
the grief is not what it once was. We can move.
That's true too.
We can move through these experiences, but we have to experience them. We have to. And what you've shared with us today is about your experience. I'm so grateful because you've shared vulnerably and openly about what you've been through, and you've also shared with all of us, and as you continue to share with your patients and your coaching clients and on the retreats and through your writing, that you've learned so much from that experience, and you've brought that experience and the learnings and the growth to everybody that you cross paths with. And we're very grateful for you doing that with us here today on the podcast. And I'd really love to connect our listeners with you and your work, and also to ask you to please share a little bit about your brand new book that's about to come out.
The best place to find me is just go to my website, drhelenapopovic.com. I do have 2 other websites depending on what you want, but if you go to the main one, it'll guide you, and that's adventurepreventsdementia.com and winningatslimming.com. So winning at slimming is obvious. It's all about dealing with disordered eating, shedding excess body fat if you need to, but through the lens of feeding your spirit, not starving your body. My father had Alzheimer's disease, mixed dementia actually, but largely Alzheimer's disease, and I was his primary carer for over 10 years after my mother died. And so I've written 2 books about that experience. The first one was really me just bumbling through trying to look after him. And that at that time, Alzheimer's was not my area of expertise. So I was on a massive learning curve. And here's the thing, it's all my personal struggles that have made me learn so much more than going to medical school ever taught me.
Yes.
So that first book is just how to start looking after someone who has dementia. And then my second book was NeuroSlimming, Let Your Brain Change Your Body. And now my third book is the sequel to the first book, and it is called Can Adventure Prevent Dementia? A Guide to Outwitting Alzheimer's. Spoiler alert, it can.
Yes. I was hoping you'd share that with us.
This is a user's guide to the brain. This isn't just about preventing Alzheimer's. This is about looking after our brain right from the get-go, because Alzheimer's doesn't happen overnight. Studies have found that the changes in our brain leading to Alzheimer's start 20 to 30, maybe even more years before we get any symptoms. Midlife high blood pressure, midlife type 2 diabetes, midlife hearing loss, 3 major risk factors. Now, as long as you get hearing aids, you're good. As long as you treat your blood pressure, you're good. As long as you treat your diabetes, and you can cure diabetes, that's another podcast, another story. We've got to start looking after our brains way early in life. Lifelong education, lifelong mental challenges, social connection. You have already done a whole podcast on the importance of social relationships, but social connection, really good relationships, halve your lifetime risk of getting Alzheimer's disease. Halve your risk. Physical exercise halves your risk, but it's not starting in your 60s. I mean, anytime you start is better. It's starting in your 20s and your 30s. We start to lose our muscle mass from our 30s onwards. if we don't do any strength training. So basically that book is looking at every possible risk factor that I could find for Alzheimer's disease and for how to, it's not just about preventing Alzheimer's, it's how to have your brain working at its best throughout your whole life. And a corollary of that is you won't get the brain fog in menopause and you won't get dementia as you age.
Thank you for the work that you are doing. The NeuroSlimming book, you very generously gifted a copy for me. And I love the way that you approach your writing. You share personal stories of people that you have met along the way, but also the science. And I know our listeners really appreciate the mix as well, the storytelling, the science, the evidence. And when it comes to anxiety and food, there's such a connection. Alcohol and food are very common ways for people to soothe themselves with anxiety. And so there's a lot more to talk about. So congratulations on the new book. I know you've got a lot of media commitments coming up, and I will put all of your websites and all of those links in the show notes. So Helena, thank you again very, very much for joining us today.
My absolute pleasure, Jodie. It's just been wonderful. And thank you for the extraordinary fabulous work you're doing. I've listened to a lot of your podcasts and I just find them brilliant.
Oh, thank you for saying that. I really appreciate that.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you again for joining us today. Thank you so much. And I very much look forward to being back with you again next week. Bye. Thank you so much for joining me for this week's episode. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe and leave a review. To keep the conversation going, I'd love you to join me over on Instagram. You'll find me at Dr. Jodie Richardson. Also, if you'd like a copy of my free 5-day mini email course, Calm Your Anxious Brain, then jump over to my website, drjodirichardson.com, and you can sign up down the bottom. I've really enjoyed having your company. Thanks so much. See you next time.